The chair asks if there are further amendments to Title II.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Scalise. For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition? Do you have an amendment?
I have an amendment to Title II.
And I want the clerk to inform us whether the time limit has been met.
It's at the desk titled Scalise-201.
It is timely, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Scalise. Strike Section 201 and make necessary conforming changes.
Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Section 201 of this cap-and-trade energy tax creates a national building code, something that we don't have in place today. If you look across the country right now, 30 states have their own state building codes, and a number of states actually go even to the local level where they have codes that are based on different cities or different parishes or counties. Just to use Louisiana for an example, right after Hurricane Katrina, our legislature passed a statewide building code. We didn't have one before. We created a statewide building code, and we took into account in our code the various segmented differences between regions of our state. In fact, the code is different in South Louisiana, where our main threats are hurricanes and flooding, much different than they are in the northern part of the state of Louisiana, where tornadoes are a bigger threat. And so if you look at the fact that 30 states have these types of statewide codes, this bill in Section 201 creates a federal code that would throw out all of those state building codes that have been worked on for years in many cases. We worked on ours for months just for our state's code. Here, with really no debate, we're creating a federal code that trumps all of the state's codes, in some cases would actually lower the standards that states have for building. And if you go back to why we have building codes and why states have done this, the purpose typically is to protect safety and health. Safety and health have always been the main driving factors behind a building code. What this bill does in Section 201, it's literally taking global warming and using global warming to trump safety and health. Because now if I'm in South Louisiana and I want to rebuild after hurricane damage, which, by the way, we had 120,000 homes in Louisiana that had more than 50% damage due to Hurricane Katrina. Under this bill in Section 201, when people are rebuilding those 120,000 homes, they would have to follow the federal building code, and in many cases that would mean they can't use the same types of strength that they might want to use in their windows. They might want to use stronger windows because they don't want the storm to blow out their windows. But under this bill, a federal standard could actually say that their windows are out of the federal code. And then what does that mean? Well, let's go to the bill and look at the penalties, because they're actually civil penalties. In this bill, we're actually creating a global warming police. Go to page 235. The Secretary may set and collect reasonable inspection fees to cover the cost of inspections required. So number one, they can come in, the federal government can come in and inspect your house and send you the bill. And if they find that you're out of compliance with this new federal code, the Secretary shall assess a civil penalty for violations of this section. And then further, going to page 236, each day of unlawful occupancy shall be considered a separate violation. We're setting up a global warming Gestapo that can literally come in, and now this new term, unlawful occupancy. So now living in your home is considered unlawful under this bill. This is ludicrous. If you go, well, first of all, let's go to the U.S. Constitution and look at the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. The 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution says the states have the right to do what they're doing if they're not prohibited by the Constitution. So states, over 30 of them, have established building codes. This bill comes in and basically says throw out the 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and the federal government's going to throw out your building code. I'd like to submit the U.S. Constitution into the record, if I can, by unanimous consent, so that it can be reviewed, because I think we also need to go to another section that talks about unlawful occupancy. The only part of the Constitution that talks about unlawful occupancy of your home says in Amendment 3, no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house. So basically, the federal government and the Constitution says the protection as a homeowner gives you the ability to determine who comes in your house. Here we're saying each day of unlawful occupancy shall be considered a separate violation and you will be subject to federal civil fines. That's what this bill does. That's what Section 201 does. And other people have looked at this. You've got a number of groups that have come out in strong opposition to Section 201 and support my amendment. I'd like to read and enter into the record a letter from about 9 different organizations, including the National Association of Home Builders, the National Association of Realtors, the Building Owners and Managers Association International, the National Apartment Association, and a number of others, who said the proposal creates a new authority for the federal government to police building codes, holds developers and owners of buildings, including homeowners, liable for not reaching federal energy efficiency mandates, even if the buildings are presumably in compliance with applicable local building codes, and establishes a civil penalty for violators of this section of the bill. This measure would have a chilling effect on development and property transfer across the spectrum of real properties. Now, we're in a housing slump right now. Why would we want to be passing legislation that creates a federal building code with civil penalties and tells people who live in their houses that they're unlawfully occupying that house if they don't meet this new federal building code when they're in compliance with their own state's federal building code? This is ludicrous. I'll enter these letters into the record, including this letter from the National Association of Home Builders, which goes even further and talks about some of the legal problems with this and also the shortfalls, how this would adversely affect homeowners in this country who would be subject to this global warming police that would be created to come in and drag you out of your house and fine you civilly in federal court because maybe you wanted to protect your family at a higher level in the federal government.
Does gentleman yield back to balance? Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Matheson.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike. Last word.
The gentleman is recognized for that purpose.
I think when we look at Section 201, there are certain aspects of that section that do warrant some change, and I will be offering an amendment to address those issues. Because I believe that the federal cause of action is a concern. But throwing out the whole section doesn't make sense to me, and that's what this amendment would do. There are significant opportunities, and I think everybody knows it, in terms of energy efficiency in our country. Significant opportunities to create lower costs for people who occupy these facilities, significant opportunities to lower energy use. This is one where most everyone agrees. Energy efficiency is a good policy for us to pursue in this country. Buildings represent roughly 40% of U.S. energy use. That's a big deal in our country. U.S. buildings are responsible for 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Section 201 sets targets for building efficiency that seeks to achieve savings of 50% above current codes by 2016. And local agencies can meet these targets with their own building codes or by the Secretary of Energy establishing codes. These targets are feasible. These codes have been endorsed by a number of industry and consumer groups, including the Alliance to Save Energy, the ACES, National Association of State Energy Officials. I just think we ought to be careful here in terms of taking meat acts and taking all of Section 201 out. We ought to address what is problematic language. As I said, I will be offering an amendment that removes this new federal cause of action against property owners for noncompliance because I do think that is an overreach and we ought to address that issue. But I would recommend voting against this amendment, and I would encourage people to take a look at the amendment that I will offer after that. I'll yield to
Mr. Chairman. Would the gentleman yield to the gentleman from Vermont?
Sure, I'll yield to Mr. Welch, yes, I will.
Well, I see that the gentleman from Michigan was seeking recognition. I'll yield to him. Yield back.
I guess those bells tell you everybody ought to listen fast. This is not the first time we have seen this amendment, nor is it the first time we have seen this language. For years, we've been trying to address this question in the energy bills that we have been pushing through this committee. During the last Congress, we tried, and the real estate lobby got similar language out. This is a very modest proposal. It is one which is needed if we're going to address the problems. Buildings are enormous users of energy. The best way to address this use is by seeing to it it's properly done in the first place, with a proper building code, and to see to it that communities do not have their building codes tinkered with by builders and by real estate folks. The end result of that is that another building goes on the market which is not suitable to the needs of the country in terms of energy conservation. This is, as I've said before, a very modest proposal. The buildings that we're talking about last 120 years. Efficiency improvements pay for themselves in 5 to 7 years. And when spread over a 30-year mortgage, the cost of efficiency improvements are more than covered by energy cost savings from day one. I think that if we're going to be serious about this business of dealing with energy and energy conservation and climate change, we have no excuse but to do exactly what the bill would do here. Inefficient buildings are a drag on the economy. Energy costs over the 30-year life of a mortgage could be as high as $100,000. And a house that's more than 50% efficient could save $50,000. This gives the owner of that house a much better source of revenue for his home and his family than might meet the eye. Because kilowatt hours cost the same no matter whether you're rich or poor, energy costs are highly regressive and hit the poor folks the hardest. Inefficient homes can help keep the poorest families poor by keeping away from that family food, clothes, and everything else that they would spend that money for. This part of the population needs energy efficiency far more than does any other part of our society. States and local governments normally adopt and enforce building codes, but have traditionally done so for fire, wiring, plumbing, safety, but not for energy efficiency. And if we're going to achieve the goal of energy efficiency and a massive saving for our people, doing so by seeing to it that the building codes represent what they should, an honest mechanism for saving and conserving energy is the best way to do it. So I urge my colleagues to support the bill as is, reject the amendment, and write a better piece of legislation. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
I think I already nodded that I would recognize the gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I move to strike the last word and support the amendment of my colleague from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise. You know, overall, it just seems to me that this Section 201 is typical of the entire bill, and particularly typical of the title that we just finished with, and that is the Renewable Energy Standards. It's a one-size-fits-all approach to the entire country. And what Mr. Scalise was pointing out is that there are differences in climate and geography and humidity and that sort of thing, and the type of windows that would be appropriate in Minnesota or the northeast of our country may not at all be appropriate for a building, either a residential or commercial building in a moist, humid, hot South Louisiana. So I don't disagree with the distinguished former chairman in regard to wanting to have energy efficiency and doing, putting best practices forward and making recommendations. But the problem, as I see it, and I think that's the whole purpose of this amendment, is there's no room for maneuvering. Indeed, as the gentleman from Louisiana said, that Big Brother can come right in and fine you for every day that you live in your own home or go to work in your own office building if you're not in compliance with a federal standard. I think this is way, way overreaching, and there needs to be some sanity brought to this issue. And that's the same concern, as I say, that I had, Mr. Chairman, in regard to the renewable energy standards that are very, very burdensome for the Southeast when you do not include nuclear and hydroelectric power and where there's not a reliable, consistent source of wind and solar. In my state of Georgia, only not even 1%, maybe 1% of our electricity right now is generated by renewable, and 60% by coal, and maybe 20% by nuclear. So here we're coming along with a massive 900-page bill. This title, maybe even more onerous than Title I in regard to one size fits all. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I don't want to drown the baby in the bathwater either. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. There are approximately 8 minutes left to go on 3 roll calls on the House floor. So at this time, we will recess with the request to the members that they return here very rapidly after those roll calls. There are many amendments that we have to process. So we'll take a recess, but please return as quickly as possible.